The smirk was Andrew Nelson's signature. It was a finely calibrated expression of condescending amusement, a weapon he wielded with the precision of a surgeon. He used it to dismiss business rivals, to charm starstruck journalists, and most painfully to remind his ex-wife Margo of the world she had lost. Tonight at the opulent Zenith Foundation Gala, that smirk was in full force, a beacon of his success. But in a few moments a hush would fall over the gilded ballroom. The cameras would turn, the whispers would start, and that billion-dollar smirk, the very symbol of his power, would crumble into dust. This isn't just a story about revenge. It's about the moment a woman erased by a man's ego reclaimed her light so brightly it blinded everyone who ever doubted her. The divorce papers had been finalized for 2 years, but the phantom limb of Margo Wenzell's old life still ached on rainy Tuesday afternoons. Her current existence was a quiet, deliberate contrast to the one she'd shared with Andrew Nelson. Her small, book-filled apartment in a pre-war building overlooked a cobbled side street a world away from the sterile, glass-walled penthouse with its panoramic views of the city that had felt more like an observation deck than a home. The air here smelled of old paper brewing tea and the faint sweet scent of oil paints from her neighbor down the hall, a comforting aroma of substance and history. Andrew had hated places like this. Places where things go to die, Margo, he'd once said, gesturing dismissively at an antique bookstore she'd wanted to explore. To him, anything that didn't gleam with the promise of future profit was already a relic. He was a man built for the future, a titan of venture capital, who saw the world not as a tapestry of human experience, but as a portfolio of assets to be acquired, leveraged, or liquidated. Margo had been for 10 years his most prized and later most depreciated asset. She had met him in college. She was a brilliant, passionate art history major, her head filled with the brushstrokes of the masters and the revolutionary fire of the Impressionists. He was a ruthless business student who saw her not just as beautiful, but as a necessary component for the life he was building. She was his duchess, the elegant, cultured wife who could host flawless dinners, discuss Renaissance art with stodgy old money investors, and smooth over the rough edges of his ambition with her quiet grace. She had put her own promising academic career on hold, convincing herself that supporting his meteoric rise was a shared victory. The cracks, invisible at first, had widened into chasms. Her opinions on art became quaint little hobbies. Her desire to finish her doctoral thesis was a distraction from our life. The final brutal fracture came the night he announced he was leaving. He hadn't shouted. Andrew never wasted energy on overt anger. He delivered the news with the calm finality of a quarterly earnings report. "It's a simple matter of synergy, Margo," he'd said, adjusting the Cartier watch on his wrist. He was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights creating a heartless halo around his silhouette. "Our brands are no longer aligned." He was already with Lauren Price, a model and influencer 20 years his junior, whose primary skill was curating a life of aspirational emptiness on social media. She was new. She was shiny. She was an asset with a high engagement rate. The part that still twisted a knot in Margo's stomach was his parting shot. She had asked, her voice trembling, what she was supposed to do. He had turned, and for the first time, she saw the full, unvarnished contempt in his eyes, accompanied by that signature smirk. "You'll get by on the settlement. But let's be honest." He'd said the words slicing deeper than any legal document. "Who are you without me? Who's going to care about some dusty art historian whose only claim to fame was being Mrs. Nelson? You're a footnote, Margo. And the world doesn't read footnotes." He had left her in that silent penthouse, a ghost in a home she'd never truly owned. The settlement was generous by any normal standard, but it was designed to be just that, a settlement. Enough to keep her quiet and comfortable, but not enough to ever touch the stratosphere of wealth and influence he inhabited. It was hush money for a decade of her life. Now, 2 years later, she wasn't just a footnote. She was writing her own book. She had re-enrolled in her PhD program, and her research was causing a quiet stir in the academic world. Her focus was on the mid-20th century French couturiers, specifically the enigmatic and reclusive genius Henri de La Renta, a designer who had vanished from the public eye at the peak of his fame, his final collection rumored to be his masterpiece but never shown. Her quiet life was interrupted by a thick cream-colored envelope that arrived by courier. The embossed seal was that of the Zenith Foundation, the philanthropic arm of a global tech conglomerate. It was an invitation to their annual gala, the most exclusive, high-stakes social event of the year. It was Andrew's world, not hers. She knew why it had been sent. A clerical error, a mailing list that hadn't been updated, an oversight. She was about to toss it into the recycling bin when she saw the gala's theme printed in elegant silver script, an ode to the unseen celebrating lost art. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. Lost art. The irony was suffocating. She looked around her small apartment at the stacks of research papers and the faded photograph on her desk of a younger, more hopeful version of herself standing beside a smiling Andrew. He had been a master at making things and people disappear. She should throw it out. Attending would be masochism. She could already picture it, Andrew parading Lauren, who would be draped in the latest soulless creation from a brand he'd just acquired. He would spot Margo across the room, and that smirk would bloom on his face, a silent public confirmation of everything he'd ever said she was. A forgotten relic in a room full of masterpieces. But as she held the invitation, a different thought, quiet and dangerous, began to form. What if he was wrong? What if a footnote read in the right light could tell the most important story of all? The theme was a sign, a cosmic coincidence she couldn't ignore. Her work wasn't just academic anymore, it was personal. It was about giving voice to the unseen, the forgotten, the brilliant things that had been locked away in the dark. She placed the invitation on her desk, a silent promise to herself. She might not go, but for the first time in 2 years, she felt the flicker of a fight she thought had been extinguished forever. Margot's research into Henri de La Renta had become an obsession. He was a ghost in the world of fashion. Unlike his contemporaries, Dior or Balenciaga, who built enduring empires, de La Renta was a shooting star. For a brief incandescent period in the late 1950s, his work was considered revolutionary. He didn't just design clothes, he sculpted with fabric, creating gowns that were both architectural marvels and deeply emotional statements. He was an artist whose medium was silk and thread. Then in 1961, he simply vanished. His Parisian atelier was shuttered, his staff dismissed, and his final, most anticipated collection rumored to be named La Cascade Céleste. The celestial cascade was never seen by the world. The official story was that he had suffered a breakdown, overwhelmed by the pressures of the industry. But Margo, piecing together fragments from his former seamstress's diaries and obscure art journals, believed something else. She believed he had created a final masterpiece so perfect, so personal, that he couldn't bear to release it to the commercial world he had grown to despise. He had chosen to become a myth rather than a brand. Her academic advisor, Professor Gideon Davies, a man with a kind face and a mind as sharp as a tack, was her greatest champion. "The establishment thinks de La Renta is a dead end, Margo," he told her during one of their weekly meetings, peering over his spectacles at her meticulously organized notes. "They see his disappearance as a failure. You see it as a statement. That's why your thesis will be groundbreaking. Find the statement." The Zenith Gala invitation sat on her desk like a ticking clock. The theme, an ode to the unseen, gnawed at her. It was a world of performative appreciation where billionaires bid on rediscovered paintings to get a tax write-off, not because they understood their value. It was Andrew's world. He would be a co-chair, his name printed just below the foundation's logo. He would give a speech about innovation and legacy, a man who had systematically dismantled her own legacy without a second thought. The urge to go was transforming from a dangerous thought into a quiet resolve. But she couldn't go as Margo Nelson, the discarded wife. She couldn't even go as Margo Wenzell, the struggling academic. If she were to step into that lion's den, she had to be armed not with jewels or a designer dress off the rack, but with something that represented her work, her mind, and her soul. She had to be the embodiment of her thesis. The breakthrough came on a cold, rainy Thursday. She was in the university's special collections library, poring over a recently acquired lot of letters from the estate of a Parisian art critic who had been a contemporary of De La Renta. Most were dry professional correspondences, but tucked into the back of a leather-bound journal was a small sealed envelope made of brittle yellowed paper. It was unaddressed. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she carefully sliced it open with a preservation knife. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a personal letter from Henri de La Renta himself. The handwriting was an elegant forward slanting script full of passionate loops and sharp decisive strokes. "My dear Jean-Pierre," it began, "you were right. The world does not want art. It wants commerce. It wants to own, to label, to reproduce until the soul of the thing is gone. I have created something that cannot be commercialized. It is not a dress. It is the echo of a supernova, the feeling of starlight on skin. I have shown it to only one person, my muse, the only one who understands that beauty is not a possession. I am sending it away with her to a place where it will be safe from the market, a place of stone and silence. My cascade will not be a commodity. It will be a secret." Margot's breath caught in her throat. This was it. The first concrete proof that La Cascade Céleste wasn't just a myth. It existed, and it wasn't destroyed. It was hidden. The letter didn't name the muse or the location, but there was one more clue. At the bottom, almost an afterthought, was a small embossed stamp, a stylized crest she didn't recognize featuring a stoat and a sprig of lavender. For the next week she worked in a feverish haze cross-referencing heraldry archives, French aristocratic lineages, and De La Renta's known associates. The stoat was a symbol of Brittany, a region known for its rugged coastline and ancient stone castles. Lavender was a symbol of Provence. It was a contradiction. Then she found it. The crest belonged to the de Valois family, a minor ancient line of nobility that had fallen from prominence centuries ago, but had retained their ancestral seat, a fortress-like chateau in Brittany. The last known matriarch of the family, a woman named Isolde de Valois, had been a celebrated patron of the arts in the 1950s, known for her ethereal beauty and her disdain for publicity. She had been De La Renta's muse. Isolde had died in the 1980s unmarried and childless. The estate and its contents had been turned over to a private foundation governed by a notoriously secretive board, the de Valois Foundation, a place of stone and silence. Her fingers trembled as she typed the name into a search engine. The foundation had no public presence, no website, just a mailing address for a law firm in Paris. It was a fortress designed to keep the world out. Professor Davies was astounded. "Margo, this is more than a thesis. This is a rediscovery of monumental importance. If that gown exists, my God, it would be the find of the century for costume history." "I have to try and see it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They're notoriously difficult," he warned. "They've denied access to scholars from the Louvre and the Met. They don't care about fame or prestige." "I know," Margo replied, her gaze distant. "That's why I might have a chance. I don't want to exhibit it. I don't want to monetize it. I just want to understand it. I want to tell its story." She spent 3 days drafting a letter. She didn't write it as an academic seeking access. She wrote it as a historian who understood the designer's final wish. She didn't mention the gown by name. Instead, she wrote about De La Renta's philosophy, about his rejection of commerce, about the sanctity of art created purely for its own sake. She quoted from his newly discovered letter. She told them she didn't want to put his secret on display, but to honor it by documenting its story for posterity, ensuring the genius behind it was never truly forgotten. She included a copy of the letter from De La Renta as proof of her discovery. She sent the letter by registered mail to the Parisian law firm. Weeks passed. The gala loomed less than a month away. She heard nothing. Despair began to creep in. Maybe it was a fool's errand. Maybe she should just stay home, let the night pass, and continue her quiet life. Then one morning an email appeared in her inbox. The sender was simply Delacroix. The subject line, regarding your inquiry. The message was brief and direct. Your letter was compelling. You seem to understand the artist's intent. The board has granted a preliminary meeting. Be at the Château de Valois. Friday, 10 a.m. Do not be late. You will be tested. Margo stared at the screen, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was going to the place of stone and silence. She was about to come face to face with the keepers of the secret, and her entire future, both academic and deeply personal, depended on what happened next. The journey to the Château de Valois felt like a pilgrimage. After a train ride to Brittany, she rented a small car and drove for hours through a landscape of windswept fields and granite outcrops that grew more severe and imposing with every kilometer. The chateau itself did not appear until she rounded a final sharp bend. It was not a fairy tale castle, but a formidable fortress, its gray stone walls rising from a rocky promontory overlooking the churning Atlantic. It was a place built to withstand sieges, a perfect sanctuary for a secret. A severe-looking man in a dark suit met her at the massive oak gates and led her through a series of cold, echoing stone corridors, their footsteps the only sound. The air was thick with the scent of sea salt and beeswax. There were no gilded ornaments or lavish decorations. The chateau's beauty was in its stark, unyielding permanence. She was led into a library. Unlike the rest of the chateau, this room was alive with warmth. A fire crackled in a hearth large enough to stand in, and every wall was lined floor to ceiling with ancient leather-bound books. Seated in a high-backed wing chair by the fire was a woman who could have been anywhere between 60 and 80. Her silver hair was coiled in an austere bun, and she wore a simple but impeccably tailored gray cashmere suit. Her face was a mask of intelligent scrutiny, her dark eyes missing nothing. "Mademoiselle Wenzell," she said, her voice crisp and devoid of warmth. "I am Marianne Delacroix. I am the executor of the de Valois estate. Thank you for coming. Please sit." Margo sat opposite her, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to stop them from trembling. This was the test. Ms. Delacroix did not waste time with pleasantries. "Your letter was audacious. You claim to understand Henri de La Renta's final wishes. Many have made similar claims. They arrive with proposals from Sotheby's, with film crews, with promises of global museum tours. They see a masterpiece as a product. Tell me why you are different." Margo met her gaze directly. "Because I believe his final masterpiece wasn't a product. It was a conclusion. It was the final sentence of the argument he had been making his entire career, that a dress can be a work of art so profound it transcends its function." Ms. Delacroix raised a skeptical eyebrow. "A lovely sentiment. But sentiment doesn't preserve history. Let's talk specifics. You believe the collection was called La Cascade Céleste. Why?" For the next hour, Margo was subjected to a rigorous oral examination. Ms. Delacroix's questions were surgically precise, designed to expose any gap in her knowledge. She quizzed her on De La Renta's stitching techniques, his unique method of draping fabric directly onto the form, his philosophical influences, the specific chemical composition of the dyes he favored. It was more intense than any PhD defense. Margo answered every question. She spoke of his use of soutache embroidery not as decoration, but as a form of linear storytelling. She explained how he pioneered the use of a lightweight silk and metal alloy thread that allowed his creations to hold their shape as if defying gravity. She connected the themes in his work to the existentialist movement of post-war Paris. She wasn't just reciting facts. She was weaving a narrative showing a deep holistic understanding of the man and his art. Finally, Ms. Delacroix fell silent. Her fingers steepled before her lips, her eyes boring into Margo. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant roar of the ocean. "You have done your research," Ms. Delacroix said, her tone softening almost imperceptibly. "But knowledge is not the same as respect. The final piece of the collection, the one he referred to in his letter to your critic friend, is not just a dress. It is the culmination of his life, a tribute to his muse, Isolde de Valois. He made it for her and only for her. When she died, her will stipulated that it should never be displayed, never sold, never even photographed. It is to remain here, a silent testament. I understand, Margot said softly. And I would never ask to break that trust. My only goal is to document its existence, to write the final chapter of his story, so that his genius is fully understood. That is how we honor him. Ms. Delacroix studied her for a long moment, a silent battle of wills playing out in the firelit room. Isolde was my aunt, she said finally, the admission hanging in the air. I grew up in this chateau. I knew Henri. I saw his devotion to his art and to her. He would have hated the modern world, the red carpets, the influencers who borrow gowns they don't understand for a fleeting moment of attention. Margot's heart sank. She had failed. The mention of red carpets felt like a direct condemnation of the world the gala represented. He would have despised the Zenith. Gala. Ms. Delacroix continued as if reading her mind. Her gaze was sharp, probing. He would have loathed the idea of art being used as a backdrop for corporate networking and vapid celebrity. This was it. The final rejection. Margot prepared herself for the polite dismissal. However, Ms. Delacroix said, leaning forward slightly, a glint of something new in her eyes, something calculating and rebellious. He also loathed bullies. He hated men of commerce who believed their wealth entitled them to dictate the value of art. He hated those who silenced true artists. Your letter. Mademoiselle Wenzell was not just about history. I read between the lines. This is personal for you. Is it not? The question was so direct, so unexpected, that it caught Margot completely off guard. The professional facade she had so carefully constructed crumbled. Yes, she whispered the single word holding the weight of her entire marriage and its bitter end. Ms. Delacroix nodded slowly. I researched you after I received your letter. I know who your ex-husband is. I have read about his new shiny life. I know he is a co-chair of this gala. The theme is a mockery, is it not, an ode to the unseen, hosted by a man who sees nothing that he cannot buy. A strange, thrilling alliance seemed to be forming in the ancient library. The board of this foundation is bound by my aunt's will, Ms. Delacroix said, a faint, dangerous smile playing on her lips. The gown can never be sold or publicly exhibited in a museum, but the will is very specific. It says nothing about it being worn, just once, by someone who understands what it represents. Margot's breath hitched. She couldn't possibly mean. You wish to write the final chapter of Henri de La Renta's story. Ms. Delacroix stated, her voice now charged with a new energy. Perhaps it is time that chapter was given a public reading. It would be a statement Henri himself would have appreciated. An act of pure, uncommercialized art in the very heart of the commercial world. A secret brought into the light for one night only to remind them all of what true value looks like. She stood up, her posture regal. Come with me, Mademoiselle Wenzell. Let me show you what you have been fighting for. Ms. Delacroix led Margot from the library up a winding stone staircase to a wing of the chateau that was clearly untouched by time. The air grew cooler, scented with cedar and dried lavender. They stopped before a heavy iron-banded wooden door. Ms. Delacroix produced an old ornate brass key and turned it in the lock. The click echoed in the silence. The room within was a sanctuary. It was a circular chamber at the top of a tower with tall arched windows overlooking the wild Atlantic. The space was sparse, containing only a single chaise lounge, a dressmaker's mannequin covered in a simple linen cloth, and a large, intricately carved cedar wardrobe. This had been Isolde's private dressing room. Ms. Delacroix walked to the wardrobe and opened its double doors. And Margot forgot how to breathe. It wasn't a dress. It was a captured nebula. The gown, lovingly preserved on a custom-made bust, seemed to absorb and radiate the soft light from the windows. It was La Cascade Céleste. Margo had imagined it 1,000 times, but the reality was infinitely more breathtaking. The base fabric was a silk charmeuse of the deepest midnight blue, a color so rich and pure it felt like looking into the infinity of space. But it was the embellishment that made it a masterpiece. Thousands of minuscule hand-sewn crystals, platinum beads, and fragments of mother-of-pearl cascaded from the structured bodice down the sweeping skirt. They weren't arranged in a pattern, but in a seemingly random, organic flow perfectly mimicking the Milky Way on a clear night. It wasn't just decorative, it was astronomical. Margo recognized constellations woven into the design: Orion, Cassiopeia, the Pleiades. The construction was unlike anything she had ever seen. The bodice was sculpted, a marvel of De La Renta's signature internal corsetry, but the skirt was a fluid, liquid dream. It moved with an impossible lightness, the metallic threads woven into the silk catching the light with every subtle shift of air. It was as if the wearer would be draped in liquid moonlight. He spent over 2,000 hours on the embroidery alone, Ms. Delacroix said, her voice soft with reverence. Each crystal was chosen for its specific refractive quality. He wanted it to look not like it was sparkling, but like it was emitting its own light. It was his love letter to the cosmos and to my aunt. Margo reached out a hand, stopping just short of touching the fabric. She could feel a strange energy emanating from it, the stored passion of its creator. This was not an item of clothing. It was the soul of an artist made manifest. It is a story, Margo whispered, her academic mind cataloging the details while her heart simply reeled in awe. The structured bodice represents the rigid laws of physics of the universe. The cascading skirt? That's the beautiful, unpredictable chaos of creation. It's a paradox. It's genius. Ms. Delacroix gave a small, proud smile. You see it. That is why you are here. She turned to face Margo, fully, her expression serious. The foundation board has agreed to my proposal. It is unconventional, and it will never happen again. We will loan you the gown for the night of the Zenith Gala. Margo felt her knees go weak. The sheer audacity of the idea was overwhelming. But this belongs in a climate-controlled vault, not at a party. Its purpose was never to sit in a vault, Ms. Delacroix countered. Its purpose was to be a statement. And for one night it will make the most powerful statement of its existence. But there are conditions, Mademoiselle Wenzell, strict conditions. Anything, Margo breathed. First, you will not speak of its origins to the press. When they ask who you are wearing, you will say the name Henri de La Renta. Let them scramble. Let the mystery be part of the statement. Second, you will be accompanied by our head of conservation, who will handle the gown at all times before and after the event. It cannot be altered in any way. It must fit you perfectly as it is. Delacroix circled Margo, her expert eye assessing her frame with the precision of a couturier. The gown had been made for Isolde, a woman known for her tall, slender grace. Margo, though not a model, had a similar build, a stroke of cosmic luck. And third, and this is the most important, Ms. Delacroix continued, her gaze locking with Margo's. You are not wearing this gown to shame your ex-husband. His reaction is irrelevant. You are wearing it as a representative of this foundation, as a scholar, and as a guardian of Henri de La Renta's legacy. You will embody the spirit in which it was made, grace, intelligence, and a profound respect for art over artifice. You are not there to start a drama. You are there to end a debate about what has true value? Do you understand? The weight of the responsibility was immense, far heavier than the gown itself. This was no longer about a personal victory over Andrew. It was about becoming a living vessel for a lost piece of history. It was about proving her own worth by championing the worth of another. I understand, Margo said, her voice firm, filled with a new and unshakable sense of purpose. Ms. Delacroix nodded, satisfied. Good. Now let us see if the ghost of my aunt approves. With the gentle, practiced hands of someone who had performed this ritual many times before, She and a conservator who had appeared as if from nowhere helped Margo step into the gown. As the cool, heavy silk settled over her skin, a shiver ran through her. It felt like stepping into a different history, a different life. The fit was uncanny, as if De La Renta had seen her across time. She turned to look at herself in the tall, silver-framed mirror. The woman who stared back was not the timid academic or the broken-hearted ex-wife. She was a figure of breathtaking elegance and strength. The gown did not wear her. It completed her. The starlight seemed to emanate not just from the fabric, but from within her. The midnight blue made her eyes seem deeper, her posture more regal. She looked inevitable. In that moment, standing in a secret room in a fortress by the sea, wearing a masterpiece that the world had forgotten, Margo Wenzell finally understood. She wasn't just going to a gala. She was a piece of unseen art about to be unveiled. And the world of shallow commerce and smug certainty would have no choice but to be silent and to look. The night of the Zenith Foundation Gala arrived like a storm front of flashbulbs and forced smiles. The Metropolitan Grand Hall had been transformed into a shimmering spectacle of excess. Towering ice sculptures dripped onto priceless antique rugs, and chandeliers glittered down on a sea of surgically enhanced faces and headline-grabbing jewels. It was a room suffocating in its own opulence. Andrew Nelson was in his element. He moved through the crowd with the predatory grace of a shark, his tuxedo tailored to within an inch of its life. On his arm was Lauren Price, a vision in a skin-tight fire-engine red gown that was less a dress and more a cry for attention. Her diamond necklace, a recent gift from Andrew, was so large it bordered on parody. Andrew Darling, a skeletal socialite, air-kissed him. "The party is a triumph. Simply divine. We do what we can to support the arts, darling." Andrew replied, his smirk firmly in place. He had already closed 2 deals tonight using the pretense of philanthropy to corner a rival tech CEO by the champagne fountain. For him, the art on the walls was merely expensive wallpaper for the real show, the trading of power and influence. A journalist from Vanity Fair approached him. "Mr. Nelson, a stunning event. Any thoughts on the theme, An Ode to the Unseen?" Andrew chuckled, a smooth, practiced sound. "It's about innovation, about finding the next big thing before anyone else does. Whether it's a forgotten painting or a startup in a garage, the principle is the same. It's about having the vision to see value where others see nothing." He glanced possessively at Lauren as if she were his latest, most brilliant acquisition. He was holding court near the grand staircase, the undisputed king of his gilded cage. He felt untouchable. His recent acquisition of a media conglomerate had put him on the cover of Forbes, and his life was a curated feed of success. He occasionally thought of Margo, but it was a fleeting, dismissive thought. He pictured her in her drab little apartment, probably grading papers, completely oblivious to the glittering world she had lost. The thought always brought the smirk back to his lips. She had been dead weight, a relic of a past he had successfully shed. "Have you heard from Margo lately?" asked Robert Wexler, an older investment banker who had known the couple for years. The question was innocent, but it pricked Andrew's ego. Andrew waved a dismissive hand. "Margo. Oh, she's pursuing her little academic passions. Very quaint. Happy for her, of course. Some people are just meant for the quiet life, you know." The subtext was clear. Some people are meant for the sidelines. Lauren, who had been pouting for a photograph, chimed in. "I saw a picture of her from a university thing. The clothes were... oh, honey. It was tragic." Andrew put an arm around her, squeezing lightly. She has her world, we have ours. And his world, he thought with deep satisfaction, was infinitely better. Across the room, the atmosphere was a low hum of gossip and networking. The biggest names in finance, technology, and entertainment mingled their laughter, echoing in the cavernous space. They were all there to see and be seen, to affirm their place in the pantheon of the successful. Everything was a competition: who had the biggest diamond, the most famous date, the most column inches in tomorrow's papers. Then the low hum began to change. It started near the grand entrance, a subtle shift in the energy of the room. A few photographers, bored of shooting the same stream of celebrities, turned their lenses toward the doorway. A guest who had been speaking stopped mid-sentence. A waiter paused, his tray of champagne flutes held aloft. The change rippled through the hall like a seismic wave. The ambient chatter faltered. Heads began to turn one by one, then in entire sections. The magnetic pull of 100 conversations shifted, all focusing on the top of the grand staircase. Andrew noticed the shift and felt a prickle of annoyance. He hated it when someone else stole his spotlight. He turned a witty dismissal already on his lips, expecting to see a late-arriving movie star or a royal. But it was no one he recognized. At the top of the stairs stood a woman, and for a moment the entire glittering, cynical, money-obsessed ballroom fell completely and utterly silent. She descended the grand staircase not like a woman walking, but like a celestial body moving through its ordained orbit. The gown, La Cascade Céleste, did not sparkle under the chandeliers. It seemed to ingest the light and reissue it as something purer, softer. The midnight silk flowed around her, a piece of the night sky come to earth, the constellations on its surface shifting with a life of their own. She wore no ostentatious jewelry, just a pair of simple, elegant diamond studs. Her hair was swept back in a classic chignon. Her face serene, her posture radiating a quiet, unshakable confidence. It was Margo. But it was not the Margo anyone in that room had ever known. The silence was broken by a sudden, frantic explosion of camera flashes. The photographers who had been listlessly snapping pictures of predictable celebrities swarmed toward the staircase, their motor drives whirring like 1,000 insects. They were shouting, jostling for position, desperate to capture the image of the ethereal vision before them. "Who is that?" The whisper spread through the crowd like wildfire. "Is that a model? My God! The dress! I've never seen anything like it. Who is the designer?" Andrew Nelson stood frozen, his champagne glass halfway to his lips. His mind struggled to process the image. The face was familiar, but the presence, the aura, the sheer breathtaking power of her appearance was utterly alien. It was Margo. His Margo. The dusty academic. The footnote. Lauren beside him was the first to speak, her voice sharp with disbelief and a sudden venomous jealousy. "Is that your ex-wife? What on earth is she wearing? It looks ancient." But Andrew didn't hear her. He was watching, his brain rebooting as the truth of the situation crashed down upon him. This wasn't a woman in a pretty dress. This was a statement. This was a work of art in motion, and it was commanding more attention, more genuine awe than every carat of diamonds and every famous name in the room combined. Margot's eyes scanned the crowd, not with nervousness, but with a calm, appraising gaze. She wasn't looking for him. She wasn't performing for him. It was then that Andrew realized the most devastating truth of all: her presence here had absolutely nothing to do with him. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, the most powerful people in the room began to gravitate towards her. Not with the fawning haste of social climbers, but with the genuine curiosity of true connoisseurs. Mr. Abernathy, the notoriously discerning director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, was the first to reach her side. "My dear Abernathy," said, his voice hushed with reverence, his eyes fixed on the gown. "I must confess I am at a loss. I have never seen such a piece. The craftsmanship is sublime." "Who is the designer?" "Henri de La Renta," Margo replied, her voice calm and clear, carrying easily in the relative quiet around her. The name dropped like a bomb. A collective gasp went through the older, more knowledgeable guests. De La Renta, the myth. It was impossible. Whispers turned to frantic searches on smartphones. The legend of the lost collection of La Cascade Céleste began to circulate in hushed, excited tones. Andrew watched, paralyzed. He saw the director of the Louvre's fashion collection push his way through the crowd to get a closer look. He saw Anna Wintour, the high priestess of fashion, observing from a distance with an expression of intense, unblinking focus. Margo wasn't just wearing a dress. She was wearing a historical event. And then their eyes met. Across the sea of stunned faces, Andrew looked at the woman he had discarded. He expected to see triumph in her eyes, a vindictive glare, and "I told you so" smirk that would mirror his own. He saw none of it. He saw a serene, self-possessed woman who looked at him not with hatred, but with a kind of detached pity. She saw him. She saw his shock, his confusion, his crumbling facade. And then she gave him the smallest, most imperceptible nod, an acknowledgment not of a shared past, but of a closed chapter. And she turned away back to her conversation with the museum director. In that instant, the smirk on Andrew Nelson's face, the carefully constructed mask of his superiority, did not just falter. It evaporated. It vanished completely, leaving behind the pale, slack-jawed face of a man who had just witnessed his entire worldview be rendered obsolete. He had built his life on the principle of quantifiable value stock prices, market cap social currency. He traded in things that were new, shiny, and loud. And in one silent, graceful descent, Margo had shown him and everyone else the immeasurable, unconquerable power of something timeless, brilliant, and real. He had called her a footnote, but she had just become the headline. And he, for the first time in his life, was utterly speechless. Lauren's petty insults, the envious glares of his rivals, the sudden feeling of being completely and utterly irrelevant, it all washed over him. The king was naked in his own court, and the ghost he thought he'd banished had just become the queen. The rest of the evening devolved into a surreal, slow-motion nightmare for Andrew. He remained physically present, a fixed point in the swirling galaxy of the gala, but his mind was reeling untethered. He watched as the world he commanded, a world that bent to the gravity of his wealth and will, seemed to inexplicably rearrange itself around a new center of mass Margo. He felt the subtle but undeniable shift in the room's energy. Conversations would pause as she passed. Heads would turn, and the quality of the attention she received was different from the fawning adulation he was used to. It was not the grasping curiosity directed at a celebrity. It was the hushed, genuine reverence reserved for a masterpiece. Lauren beside him had grown increasingly agitated. Her initial shock had curdled into a bitter, resentful fury. "Can you believe the nerve?" she hissed into his ear, her grip on his arm painfully tight. "She planned this, Andrew. She did this to embarrass us. That dress is probably some knockoff she had made." A month ago, Andrew would have agreed, would have laughed it off and delivered a cutting remark to soothe Lauren's ego. But he couldn't. He had seen the look in the eyes of Director Abernathy, a man who could spot a fake from 100 paces. He had seen the rapt attention of the critic from Le Monde. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that whatever was happening was devastatingly real. "Just ignore her," he muttered, but the command was hollow. He couldn't ignore her. He was trapped in her orbit. He watched as she moved with an unstudied poise he had never seen in her before. This wasn't the hesitant, accommodating woman who used to check his expression for approval before speaking. This was someone entirely new, or perhaps someone ancient within her that he had never bothered to see. He tried to re-engage, to reclaim his territory. He cornered a junior senator to talk policy and funding, but saw the man's eyes flick over his shoulder towards the growing circle around Margo. He attempted a joke with Robert Wexler, the banker, who responded with a distracted smile, his gaze also fixed on the woman in the midnight gown. It was as if Andrew had become a ghost at his own feast. The power he projected, the intimidating aura of his success, was being completely neutralized, absorbed by the quiet, luminous presence of his ex-wife. He couldn't stand it any longer. It was a physical compulsion, an ego-driven need to confront the anomaly, to understand it, and by understanding to somehow contain and control it again. He needed to re-establish the narrative. He was the titan, she was the afterthought. He excused himself from Lauren's toxic muttering and began to walk towards the terrace where Margo stood bathed in the cool light of the moon, speaking with a small, captivated group. Each step felt like wading through molasses. He felt hundreds of eyes on his back, sensing the impending confrontation. He squared his shoulders, summoning the last vestiges of his bravado. He was Andrew Nelson. He did not get upstaged. "Margo," he said, his voice emerging tighter and more strained than he intended. The effect was instantaneous. The small group of admirers, which included a renowned art historian and a tech billionaire, who had just pledged millions to the foundation, read the tension in the air. With polite, knowing glances, they offered quiet farewells to Margo and melted back into the party, leaving the two of them alone on the precipice between the glittering ballroom and the dark, silent night. The sudden quiet was deafening. Up close, the effect of the gown was even more profound. It wasn't just clothing, it was an atmosphere. He felt small beside it, terrestrial and crude. He had to regain control. The dress, he began, the word sounding inadequate as soon as it left his lips. He gestured vaguely at the cosmic wonder she was wearing. "It's quite something. A lucky find at a vintage store." The question was an instinctive jab, a desperate reflexive attempt to diminish the moment, to reduce her triumph to mere chance, to categorize it as a simple transaction he could understand. A soft, genuine smile touched Margot's lips, and the sight of it was more disarming than any angry retort would have been. It was not a smile of triumph or malice. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated freedom, and it was utterly devastating. "No, Andrew." "It's not from a store," she said, her voice perfectly level, carrying the calm weight of undeniable truth. "It's the centerpiece of my doctoral thesis. It's Henri de La Renta's lost masterpiece, La Cascade Céleste. It was loaned to me for the evening by the de Valois Foundation, the private estate that protects his legacy." Every word was a carefully placed charge that detonated a pillar of his worldview. Doctoral thesis. The work he'd mocked. Masterpiece. The kind of value he claimed to understand but clearly didn't. Loaned to me. The most crucial, soul-crushing phrase. This wasn't something she had purchased with his settlement money, a final defiant use of his own power against him. This was something she had earned. It was a reward for her intellect, her dedication, her passion, all the parts of her he had deemed worthless. You found it." The question came out as a choked whisper. He felt the foundation of his superiority cracking beneath his feet. The world was not supposed to work this way. Value came from capital, from acquisition, from force of will. It didn't come from dusty books and forgotten histories. "I did," she said simply, offering no further detail, allowing the immense weight of that accomplishment to settle upon him. "My work led me to it." He searched his mental arsenal for his signature smirk. It was his shield, his weapon, his punctuation mark in every conversation. But it was gone. His facial muscles had forgotten how to form the expression. In its place was a hollow, gaping vulnerability. He had spent years building an empire of things that could be bought, sold, and leveraged, and she had uncovered a treasure so profound it was priceless. A desperate need to reclaim some semblance of grace, of control, washed over him. I'm glad you're doing well, Margo." He managed to say the words, feeling like ash in his mouth. It was a pathetic, transparent attempt to sound magnanimous, to cast himself as the benevolent ex-husband pleased with her minor success. Her expression softened, but it was with pity, not warmth. "I'm not doing well, Andrew," she corrected him, her voice gentle but firm, cutting through his pretense with surgical precision. "I'm doing what I was always meant to do, the person I always was. You just couldn't see it." She looked past him, then her gaze landing on Mr. Abernathy, who was discreetly trying to catch her eye from across the room. A new purpose lit her features. "Now, if you'll excuse me," she said, her tone shifting from personal to professional, a clear dismissal. "Director Abernathy has just offered on behalf of the Met to fund the final year of my research. They also want to publish my thesis as a lead title for their publishing house next fall. We have a lot to discuss." And with that she turned. She didn't storm off. She simply moved on, drawn away by the pull of a future she had built for herself, a future he had no part in. The celestial cascade of her gown flowed behind her, a river of starlight erasing the memory of his presence. Andrew stood frozen on the terrace, the sounds of the gala behind him seeming distant and meaningless. He was surrounded by 1,000 of the world's most powerful people, yet he had never felt so completely and utterly alone. He had called her a footnote. The word echoed in his mind a monument to his own spectacular blindness. He saw it now with sickening clarity. He hadn't been the author of her story, benevolently allowing her a small mention. He had only ever been a single, poorly written sentence in the preface, a minor obstacle, an early bit of conflict she had to overcome before the magnificent sweeping narrative of her real life could begin. Margo didn't look back. She spent another 20 minutes in an animated, joyful discussion with Abernathy, finalizing the details of a future she could scarcely have dreamed of. Then, accompanied by the silent, watchful conservator, she retrieved her simple cloak and walked toward the exit. She glided past the gawking guests and the still flashing cameras, her mission accomplished. As she stepped out into the cool, clean night air, leaving the overheated artifice of the gala behind, she felt no vengeful glee. There was only a profound sense of peace, of rightness. The gown would return to its silent sanctuary in Brittany, its powerful statement made. But the woman who wore it was now and forever seen. She was her own singular constellation, finally shining in her own sky. In the end, the story wasn't about the gown as magnificent as it was. It was about the moment Margo realized that her worth wasn't something her ex-husband could take from her because he had never been the one to grant it. She had carried it inside her all along, buried under years of doubt and dismissal. That night she didn't just wear a dress, she wore her own rediscovered brilliance. She reminded everyone in that room and everyone who hears her story that the most powerful spotlight is the one that shines from within. True value is never loud. It's not determined by a price tag, and it can't be acquired in a hostile takeover. It's earned through passion, intelligence, and the quiet courage to write your own story, even after someone else has tried to write you off as a footnote. What did you think of Margo's incredible transformation? Have you ever had a moment where you proved someone wrong who underestimated you? Share your stories in the comments below. We read every single one. And if you found this story as inspiring as we did, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more tales of triumph and empowerment. Your support helps us bring these powerful stories to light.